Glory to Jesus Christ. Father Jason here. Um, I've been in YouTube prison for a week and a little more than that, and I will make a video explaining that. But for our immediate purposes, I hope to address what's happening with regard to Pope Francis, the war in Ukraine, and the decision of the Ukrainian government to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. How that is different from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I'm not Orthodox, but I do understand these distinctions, which I also understand can be confusing to a North American audience. So here's what Pope Francis said recently about the law in Ukraine banning the Moscow-linked Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I'll call the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for really what it is. It's the Russian Orthodox Church. I'll call it that just to minimize confusion with the actual Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is the Orthodox Church recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who has been around a lot longer than the Patriarch of Moscow. This is going to upset people who are linked with the Russian Orthodox Church. They're going to say this is all ecclesiastical nonsense, that there's only one Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and it's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I don't believe that. I think that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a misnomer. It's really controlled by Moscow, and despite the protestations of their leadership to the contrary, the fact is they take their direction from Patriarch Kirill. So let's look at this. Here's what Pope Francis said. He said, "I continue to follow with sorrow the fighting in Ukraine and the Russian Federation. And in thinking about the laws recently adopted in Ukraine, I fear for the freedom of those who pray, because those who truly pray always pray for all. A person does not commit evil because of praying. If someone commits evil against his people, he will be guilty of it, but he cannot have committed evil because he prayed. So, let those who want to pray be allowed to pray in what they consider their church. Please, let no Christian church be abolished directly or indirectly. Churches are not to be touched." Nobody can disagree with what he says about people being allowed to pray. But this seems, to my mind, to be a red herring here. The discussion should be about how the Ukrainian government deals with an organization on its territory, the Russian Orthodox Church, presenting as a religious body, but which is really a political and cultural outpost for an adversary which is targeting civilians. Just today, Russia sent in 100 missiles and over 100 drones attacking, yes, again, you heard it, civilian infrastructure. So because the Pope could have asked, let's put it this way, perhaps the Pope could have asked why the Ukrainian legislature voted so overwhelmingly for this law. That would have been, I think, wonderful. As an aside, it is a law which gives these Russian Orthodox churches, parishes, 9 months to sever ties with Moscow. However, the Pope turns it into a discussion on freedom of prayer, and that's not what this is about. This springs from a misconception in the Vatican and in the West generally regarding the role of religion in Russia and its historic satellites. So we have to stop looking at churches in the Russian historical sphere as we look at churches in the American sphere. In the American sphere here, we come, we pray, we go home, and there's no role of the government in Sunday's business. And we just assume that that's the way it is around the world. Not so. Not so in Russia. From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great to Catherine the Great, the church has always, and I want to underscore this, it has always been a branch of Kremlin political power over the populace. And it has been a vehicle for influence and diplomacy abroad. You can rarely speak in absolutes when you speak about history, but about this, relationship between church and state in Russia from the time of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great onward. You can speak in absolutes that the Kremlin has utilized the church for political gain. One of the great standouts to this, I just spoke about absolutes, but one of the great standouts to this is Saint Philip of Moscow. But he was put to death, I think, by Ivan the Terrible. And then, so we don't want to get too far into that, but the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does not have one legally registered church in Russia, on the other hand. So everyone is in a tizzy about the Ukrainian government banning the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Now, let's pause that, whether you're on one side of that or the other. Let's pause that. Let's look at Russia. What is the status of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine? What's the status of that entity in the territory of Russia? It doesn't exist. It's not allowed to. They're not allowed to register. There is no Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Russia. Well, let's broaden this a little bit. What's the status of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Russia? It doesn't exist. It does not have one legally registered church in all of Russia. Now, there are Ukrainian Catholics there. There are Ukrainian Catholic priests who served there since the 90s. They have liturgies, but it's all off the record. They're not allowed to legally exist. Okay, well, let's forget the ethnic thing. What about, the Russian Byzantine Catholic Church? Again, it does not have even one officially registered parish in the entire massive country. They meet, as do the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, under the aegis of the Roman Catholic Diocese, and they have to do so off the record. Now, this has been going on not just since the collapse of the USSR in 1991, but for centuries. Centuries. Wherever the Russian Empire goes, there the Eastern Catholic churches are banned, either within a day, a month, or a year. So why the sudden outrage in the Vatican and among my fellow conservatives when the small kid on the block gives Russia a dose of its own medicine for the first time since Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s? If the Vatican is concerned about letting people pray, and I hope they are, then answer me this. Why has the Vatican not appointed a bishop for their own people in Russia since 1951? I'm speaking about the Russian Byzantine Catholic Church. Blessed Clement Sheptitsky, the brother of the very venerable Metropolitan Andrew Sheptitsky, he died as the exarch of the Byzantine Catholics in 1951. And the Vatican, which is concerned about the right for people to pray and pray within their own tradition, the Vatican has not provided these long-suffering sheep of their own flock with a shepherd since 1951. If people don't need bishops to exist, then why bother appointing bishops at all? Well, you see, the bishops are important, for without them there is no church on earth to continue a sacramental life. The real reason here is that the Vatican has not appointed a bishop or an exarch for these long-suffering Byzantine Catholics and Ukrainian Catholics in Russia because they are a political embarrassment for the Vatican. We, Greek Catholics, whether Russian Greek Catholic or Ukrainian Greek Catholic, we make it difficult for the Vatican to have a cocktail discussion with Moscow, and that's just a simple fact. So let us look now at the role of religion in Ukraine. Unlike in Russia, which has banned these organizations. Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Greek Catholic, Russian Byzantine Catholic have banned them. Unlike in Russia, however, Ukraine has, since the Soviet Union's dissolution, provided an amazing latitude for these denominations and even sects and cults, foreign denominations. I mean, Hare Krishna, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Methodists, Baptists, Pentecostals, Roman Catholics. I met all of them when I was there. They could register in Ukraine without too much trouble. They did sometimes have trouble getting, buildings, and that's true. But existing, getting permits, having worship services, a lot of that came down to local bureaucrats. But they were able to exist with freedom. And these religious bodies meet regularly and they function well. They even have a national council. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. They even have like a national council of churches where they speak and they meet in kind of Congress and discuss things, their concerns, the local, the state, and the federal level in Ukraine. So Ukraine has actually, among all of the Eastern European countries, one of the most efficient councils for different churches to meet and talk about problems and things they can cooperate on. And on top of this, Ukraine does not usurp those churches for any imperial goal. And this is the beautiful thing about Ukraine, is that there really is freedom of religion. And for the past 30 years, it has extended that freedom to the Russian Orthodox Church to the point of a fault. Russia, on the other hand, is different. You see, Russia, religion has been part of Russia's war against its perceived enemies since the collapse of the Soviet Union and long before that. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, people have to realize this, that most of its funding for foreign espionage, it was clawed back, except for that department in the FSB that dealt with religious propaganda. That wasn't clawed back. That office stayed open. The Russians get the importance of religious diplomacy and using religion, home and abroad, for political purposes. And that office was also active in Ukraine from the earliest days after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I lived there in the late 90s, and I remember up into the early 2000s, the role that the Russian Orthodox Church played in fomenting division within Ukraine. I remember in 2001, when Pope St. John Paul II greatly desired to visit his long-suffering flock in Ukraine, there was this tremendous pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church against that holy Pope to not visit Ukraine. And the Russian Orthodox Church, I saw this with my own eyes, distributed posters showing the Pope John Paul II as a puppet of Satan. Well, finally, when St. John Paul II prevailed in coming to Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church shut down the ancient and famed Kiev Cave Monastery during the entire time that the Pope was in Kiev. This is in the summer of 2001. Moscow feared him then, the same way Moscow feared Metropolitan Isidore in the year 1441. They feared losing control of the church and the allegiance of her people to a power greater than their own despotism. Outfitting the church as a tool for political, military power, this was used by Stalin, and it's used by the revived Russian imperial powers. For example, in 2014, when Russia first began this war by invading eastern Ukraine and Crimea, a Russian commando team was sheltered in a monastery before igniting the first violence of this conflict. So they were sheltered in a monastery. Russia used the Russian Orthodox Church as an information center, and they used their the properties of the Russian Orthodox Church around Ukraine as storage facilities for weapons, especially in the far eastern parts of Ukraine. The leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, blessed the Russian invasion in 2022, calling it a holy war. So because of these and many other examples, Ukrainian police have investigated 100 and they've charged 50 of these Moscow-aligned priests with espionage or spreading Russian propaganda in wartime. And all nations at war do this. If you can look in, choose the country, and there are always fifth columns within a country during wartime. And if there are priests, laymen, it doesn't matter, if they are committing treason or if they're cooperating with the nation you're at war with, then they are interrogated, arrested, imprisoned, or deported. So that's not anything out of the ordinary. We're not talking about butchering them and doing something unchristian or inhumane and mangling their bodies or anything like that. God forbid. But it's certainly within the authority of the state to exercise this kind of discretion. And a further point here is a majority of Ukrainians support banning the Russian-aligned branch of this church. A poll in April by the, I think it was the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, I may get that wrong, but they found, I remember this, 63% of Ukrainians favored outlawing the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. 83% of Ukrainians believe that the state should intervene in the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church to one degree or another. I want to repeat that. 63% favored outlawing it altogether. 83% said, well, the state needs to intervene against this church and choose the threshold of intervene, but it needs to intervene. Ukrainians don't see banning this church as a question of religious freedom. They associate that church with the Russian government. And it's on that basis that the Ukrainian government has proceeded to pass this law banning the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Now that we've looked at the Russia-Ukraine context, I want to switch and look at the historical context of papal political drama since the 9th century. And I want to do this very quickly. This is important. It's important because we need historical context here and some theological finesse. It is important because it sets in contrast for our minds the difference between the fallible and the infallible, between the human and the divine, between the theological and the merely political. When he speaks as Peter, open your heart. But when he speaks as a politician, close your ears. Here's an outline of some controversial political accords made by popes throughout history. And this is not exhaustive and it's not terribly deep. But let's start off by looking at the donation of Constantine in the 8th century. It was a forged Roman imperial decree by which Constantine the Great supposedly transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope. And this was shown to be a forgery by the 15th century. I think his name was Lorenzo Valla, but it was shown to be a forgery. The controversy here is that that forged document was used to legitimize papal authority over political rulers in Western Europe, leading to centuries of tension between the church and the secular rulers. Jesus said, what belongs to God is God's, what belongs to Caesar's is Caesar's. There's a distinction between the two. So this forged document, it led to a lot of tension between church and state. You can look at the Concordat of 1801, between Pope Pius VII and Napoleon Bonaparte, and it reestablished the Catholic Church in France after the evil Masonic bloodletting of the French Revolution. Now, the controversy is that the church did regain certain privileges, but Napoleon retained significant control over church appointments. And this led to debates about the church's autonomy. So, okay, the church gets some properties and privileges, but the really important thing is the shepherding of the flock. As we said earlier in the video about the role of bishops, is that you have no bishop, you have no church. And so the controversy with the Concordat of 1801 is that the most important thing, the appointment of bishops, Napoleon has a hand over this, as most monarchs did in the 1700s, 1800s in Europe. But the church gets her property. So what's the priority here? Not always the property even. Let me correct myself there, but privileges. You can look at the Lateran Treaty of 1921. There was a lot of good that came out of it. There was a lot of bad that came out of it. Pius XI and Benito Mussolini, and it established Vatican City as an independent sovereign country. But the treaty was really a PR win for the fascists, who used it to legitimize Mussolini's regime, and this subsequently led, predictably, to criticism that the church had compromised her great moral authority in exchange for territorial gains. And again, no one's perfect, but the purpose of this list is to show that when the papacy enters into agreements or discussions of a political nature, the charism of infallibility does not extend to that, and we Catholics have to understand that. Let's look at, let's move it up a little more into the modern era in the 1960s and 70s with Ostpolitik. This was really, it's a nice fancy word. Throw it around at parties and people will think you're intelligent, but Ostpolitik was really the term that described the various diplomatic efforts by Pope Paul VI and later John Paul II under the famous Cardinal Casaroli to improve relations with communist governments in Eastern Europe. Okay, the controversy here is that the church cooperated with oppressive regimes, thus weakening her position on human rights, on religious freedoms, by remaining quiet and by refraining from open condemnation of communism, as was common and forceful under previous popes, from Pio IX, Leo XIII, Pius XI, Pius XII. And then we come up to our own day with the Vatican-China Accord 2018. This is a provisional agreement between the Vatican and the Chinese government on the appointment of bishops, and it's aimed at normalizing relations between the Holy See and the communist dictatorship of China. Of course, there's controversy here because this agreement compromises the church's independence and authority by giving this oppressive, communist Chinese government an outsized role in the spiritual affairs of the church, endangering Christ's flock in China, who in conscience, many of whom resist the materialistic Marxist atheism of their oppressive masters in Beijing. So there's a controversy here, in that the faithful see and live for decades under this satanic political system, and that's what it is. But then they're kind of sold out, and the Vatican won't even release the details of it. They're definitely sold out by the Vatican, who cooperates with this regime in the appointment of bishops. So there's a lot of controversy here, and by no means in any of these examples can people even think that the Pope is infallible in these political decisions. So I want to get back to what we say. When Peter speaks as Peter, open your hearts. When Peter speaks as a politician, close your ears, because there's no guarantee of infallibility in any sense, or and not just speaking infallibly, but speaking as a pastor, he's putting on a different hat. He's the head of a secular state, and he's also the head of the visible head of Christ's church here on earth. Let's get back to the role of the papacy in the 19th, 20th century before we get into the situation with Ukraine. Few leaders were such scourges of communism as the good Pius XI. His hatred of Bolshevism can be traced at least to 1920, when he was the apostolic nuncio in Poland, and he bucked the trend of the diplomatic community by staying in Warsaw at the risk of his own life as the godless Soviets approached in certain victory. Inexplicably, the weaker Polish army ended up winning, and it made all of these members of the diplomatic community who fled, it made them look cowardly, and it made the future Pius XI, who stayed, it made him look real good. He refused to leave the Catholic faithful. He refused to leave them on their Golgotha, and he stayed and gave them spiritual support as they fought the godless Bolsheviks. Because he did this cemented a good relationship with Poland. It cemented a good and long relationship between this future Pope Pius XI and Marshal Pilsudski, pre-war Poland's military leader. And so this fighting spirit of these pontiffs from Pius IX to Pius XII against communism is all the more impressive when it's seen against the backdrop of the Vatican's myopic 1960s policy of Ostpolitik, which sought to increase the political freedom of Catholics living under the Iron Curtain. How? By abandoning this anti-communist rhetoric of the previous popes and by engaging in cordial relations with the communist dictators. Despite its good intentions, Ostpolitik actually worsened the situation of Christians under communist rule. I want to repeat that. Despite the good intentions of people like Cardinal Casaroli and members in the Secretariat of State and the popes, this policy of Ostpolitik actually worsened the situation of Christians under communist rule, especially the large catacomb Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and it led to embarrassing situations, such as, the Vatican's unsuccessful attempt to force Hungary's heroic Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty into submitting to his communist oppressors. Don't ask me to explain that, but they did. It led to other embarrassing situations, like where the Vatican was seen to publicly be ignoring and shunning the heroic confessor of the faith, Patriarch Joseph Cardinal Slipy. This man who suffered for the faith in Siberian gulags for, I think, a better part of 20 years, 18 years. Or another example was, Pope John the 23rd's refusal to sign a Vatican II document condemning communism. So we've just gone through some of this and recognize that the Pope has two hats at least. He speaks as the chief apostle of the visible church on earth, an institution which is divine in its founding and is infallible in its charism. However, he also speaks as the head of a secular monarchical government, the Vatican, an entity which is not divine, and it is not at all infallible. Just look at the Elton John movie, partly funded by Vatican investment entities. So, seeing as the Pope was speaking recently in relation to a law passed by another secular state, namely wartime Ukraine, the content of which does not relate to his Catholic subjects, and it seems, therefore, that a reasonable person would conclude the Pope is speaking as the head of Vatican City State, which makes sense, seeing as it's often involved in diplomacy between warring nations. Therefore, speaking as the head of state, Pope Francis opens himself up to honest criticism of the Vatican's duplicity. The Vatican has never spoken out against Russia's banning of Ukrainian Orthodox churches on its territory. You cannot go to, let's say, Moscow and attend, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine services. It doesn't exist. And funny thing, all of these areas where Russia has conquered, there are no churches of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine. There are no Ukrainian Greek Catholic churches. They've been shuttered, boarded up. Why is it that all of these Protestant churches are being persecuted on the territory that Russia has conquered? So, and during the war, the Vatican has never spoken out against Russia banning the Ukrainian Orthodox churches on its territory. During the war, the Vatican has never spoken up regarding the banning of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church on Russian territory. You can't go to attend a Ukrainian Greek Catholic church in St. Petersburg. You know, there are many Ukrainian Catholics in Russia, but if they worship and have a service with a Ukrainian Catholic priest, it's all unofficial. They're not allowed to own a property, to register their parish like we have here. And God bless the Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox. You can go to Cleveland, you can go to San Francisco, you can go to Miami, you'll find a Russian Orthodox church. I have no problem with that. But why can't that be reciprocated? And why doesn't the Vatican call that out? It's peculiar. And within those spheres where the Vatican does have authority, namely appointing bishops for the humble flock of Catholics in China or for the Byzantine Catholics in Russia, in those areas where the Vatican does have authority, it defers to the will of the tyrant over the needs of the little flock. So these people who want to pray, as Pope Francis said in his Angelus a couple days ago, these people who just want to pray in their own churches, they're not allowed to. And the Vatican has not spoken publicly about that. Yet when Ukraine bans the Russian Orthodox Church on its own territory, all of a sudden the Vatican speaks up about this in the person of Pope Francis. So we love Peter, we love Pope Francis, we love the papacy, but we love it so much that we want it to shine. We want it to speak like, Peter spoke. We want the papacy to speak with courage and conviction and consistency for her own persecuted minority, and not for these people who aren't even part of the church. And we don't want the papacy rushing to the defense of the tyrants. It's not fair. It undermines the little flock. So given this background, when Pope Francis speaks on this, not as Peter, but as the head of the Vatican city-state relating to legislation of a foreign nation, it comes across as the embodiment of sanctimonious dissonance. I think people hear about this and they think this: is this just another case of a venerable figure, swathed in vestments of venerable eminence, but as craven in convictions as a moth to a flickering candle of political expedience? Today I heard someone say how vacuous is the echo of this voice when it crescendos with the fervor of 1,000 angels, only to falter into the void of silence when it comes to the crimson atrocities perpetuated by the Russian tyrant. The very claws that maim his own flock, and historically among his most long-suffering of flocks. I think it gets to the point where, you want to ask, does he not behold the same crimson rivers of blood that weep from the earth, staining the very fabric of Christendom? Does he not hear the cacophony of wails that ascend from the lips of the innocents, crushed beneath the heel of the Russian bear's insatiable hunger for more power, more land? Yet this same Vatican, whose flock is scattered like lambs before the wolves of war, chooses to cast its gaze upon the distant hills of Ukraine, where amidst the tempest of war, a fledgling nation strives to stand firm against the relentless tide of a tyrant. I don't want to go on too much on a rant here, but permit me a little one. In this quest for a balanced narrative, it seems that the head of Vatican City State besmirches the valorous Ukrainians with the same brush that should be reserved for the monsters that maraud in their midst. I can already hear people telling me that, the cries of a people yearning for freedom are but a nuisance to people in the Vatican. They're a pesky fly to be swatted away with the back of a hand stained with the ink of diplomatic convenience. Let us not offend Moscow. All the while, Mother Russia keeps a pillow over the face of her much smaller victims. No words of account are to be found there. So what this says to outside observers is this: the Vatican, once a bastion of moral fortitude, is now a mere pawn in the grand chessboard of international politics. So I'm not speaking about Christ's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I'm speaking about the role that the Vatican as a secular nation is playing in current affairs. And that role, certainly, hear my words, can be a good one. But it's not always, and it's not lately. The Vatican, once a bastion of moral fortitude, and you see that with its vast diplomatic network, nations want to tap into it because of that moral fortitude. But this same Vatican is now a mere pawn in the grand chessboard of international politics. Its current steward wields the scepter of Peter, and while he serenades the world with, canticles of peace, he seems to be, with regard to the long-suffering Christians in Ukraine, he seems to be as cold as the Siberian steppe, where the cries of the oppressed are muffled by the haunting howls of the Kremlin's wolves. It's rather tragic. What a tragic tableau, the Vatican presents as it cavorts with the shadows of power, miters all askew, revealing the cracks in the crown of fading integrity. Your silence in the face of such heinous transgressions against the devout faithful in China, the Byzantine Catholics in Russia, whether ethnically Ukrainian or Russian, it doesn't matter, but the silence in the face of the transgressions against these very devout faithful who experience a far greater attack than anything found in the Ukrainian law restricting the Russian Orthodox Church is a symphony of betrayal. Each unspoken note is a dirge for the souls crushed beneath the weight of Russian malfeasance. Yet the Vatican finds the audacity to sermonize about the trifling missteps of a nation desperately fighting for its very existence, wielding the staff of accusation with the same alacrity that you neglect the crozier of protection. So with regard to the Vatican's treatment of Ukraine these past 2 years, with regard to the Chinese Catholics these past 6 years, or the Eastern Rite Catholics in Russia these past 70 years, and the grand tapestry of history, the Vatican's image will be but a tawdry thread, a testament to the decay of a once noble institution that now panders to the capricious whims of despots. How utterly lamentable, and I want to stress this, how utterly lamentable that the keys to the kingdom of heaven now jingle in the pockets of men so woefully obtuse to the cries of the faithful, so blind to the suffering of Christ, and so deaf to the clarion call of justice. I think it's time for a revolution in the Vatican. And that revolution is the revolution of sanctity. We need a secular state that is on fire with the mission of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Our faith is not in the Vatican. Our faith is in Christ. Our faith is in the one Catholic and Apostolic Church that Jesus Christ founded and put Peter at the head of it, with bishops, priests, deacons, our religious, helping the faithful get to heaven. Nothing else matters. Get to heaven. And if the Vatican cannot achieve that goal, then it needs to get out of the way. It exists to aid the salvation of souls.